Why was the medieval knight's shield so often this shape? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, this is such a famous shape of shield. We've got another one up there, a symbolic one with the club logo on, and it's such a famous style or shape of shield that in fact we just kind of recognise it as a knight's shield. Whether it's a Lego man or Playmobil or it's a cartoon, anime, whatever, if someone has a shield, even the early Captain America, that is this shape, you think of a medieval knight. But why? Well, why, first of all, is because they were used by medieval knights. There's no question about that, and I'm not going to pull out any great twists to the story in this video. But the question is why? Why was this shape of shield so universally associated with the European medieval knight? Why did they end up with this shape of shield, and why did no one else have this shape of shield? Well, indeed, the first thing we have to establish is, yes, absolutely categorically, this style of shield, sometimes known as a heater shield, incidentally, and we'll talk about the way that it's held and strapped in a bit as well. But this particular shape of shield, known as a heater shield in the Victorian period and since, largely because it looks like a Victorian period cast iron for ironing your clothes, not at all a period term. We don't know, in fact, certainly I've never seen any medieval references to this shape of shield, just simply known as a shield. So as far as we know, they didn't have any specific special name for this style of knightly shield, possibly because it was just so common and so normal, they just called that a shield. But the fact is that yes, absolutely, this was used by medieval knights, or men-at-arms we should more correctly call them, because not all of them were knighted, between the, let's say, the 12th century and the 16th century. Now, caveat that slightly, the ancestors of this shield were actually used before that, and we'll talk about that in a second and where this shield came from. And equally, by the 16th century, this wasn't a very common type of shield to find around. This shape of shield kind of saw its last heyday, shall we say, in the 15th century. But for knights and men-at-arms, shields, whilst they were still being used in tournaments and they were being used on the battlefield, various types of shields, this type of knightly shield wasn't used very much in war anymore by the second half of the 15th century, but certainly still around quite a lot in the first half of the 15th century. So it saw several or a few hundred years worth of use, and if we include the predecessor to this, it really stems from the 11th century. You could even perhaps debatably say the late 10th century. So really, we've got several centuries there of use of this style of shield. But we must also be very categorical to state that this was not the only style of shield used by knights in this period. There were other styles of shield, which I'm not going to go into in this video because they are worthy of a video of their own topic. But yes, absolutely elongated, long sort of rectangular shields were used, highly curved rectangular shields were used, round shields were used, and variations of this type of shield as well. And I might talk a little bit about those, but there were specialised versions with cutouts and flutes and such like, and we'll talk about that maybe towards the end of this video. But I want to say before I go on, whilst I'm going to go into some detail about the development of this, where it came from, perhaps why other people didn't have it, I am going to give one reason while I've been formulating this video and thinking about the topic over the last few weeks, is my opinion of why this type of shield is not seen more widely outside Europe, for example. So where did the heater shield, as we'll call it, because that's a fairly common modern name for it, even if it's not historically correct, where did the knightly heater shield come from? Well, quite simply, we know that. It's fairly easy to answer, and many of you watching this will already know. It came from what's commonly called the Kite shield. Again, the Norman Kite shield is not a historical name for it. It's just the type of shield that was popularly, or should we say most famously, used by the Normans. Now, we should also mention that the Normans weren't the only people using these styles of shield. This style of shield, which is held in the same way as the later heater shield, these types of shields came about probably around the year 1000 AD, okay, such that by famously by the Battle of Hastings, 1066, Bayeux Tapestry, we see pretty much everyone on both sides. There are some exceptions. You see some round shields and some kind of oval type shields, almost sort of oblong. But most, like 90-something% of people on the Bayeux Tapestry are using this kite shield. But we do also find it in other artistic sources from the period. We don't have, as far as I know, any archaeologically remaining, incidentally, but we do find it in other art sources. And we find it from art sources all over Europe. We find it from the west to the east, from the north to the south, and of course the Normans did, and their predecessors, the Vikings, did of course have contacts all over Europe, whether it's down in the Byzantine Empire and down in Sicily, all the way up to Scandinavia, all the way across to Russia, and all the way across to Spain, and in fact beyond to North Africa as well, and the Islamic states on the north of Africa, and of course remember Spain at that time. There's quite a bit of Spain was also under Muslim control. So this type of shield is also to be found, incidentally, outside what we'd commonly think of as Europe today, and it is found certainly in North Africa, and you could say it almost stretched to what we'd conventionally now call the Middle East. So this type of shield did see a wide amount of use, and although we commonly refer to it as a Norman kite shield, it actually spread beyond that. And if we look at the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, we actually see that this type of shield was probably being used. It was certainly being used by the Crusaders, by all of the Crusaders, regardless of where they came from, but it was probably being used by some of the forces they were fighting against as well. So this type of long shield did see an awful lot of use, and I think there's very little doubt that this did give rise to the heater shield, and we can see the development from this to this shape. Now, before we talk about the development from the kite shield to the heater shield, we just want to briefly consider what is special about this kite shield, because this actually was a big leap, certainly in most of Europe. This was a big leap from what had gone before. So what had gone before? Well, the so-called Viking shield, as lots of people would call it, is actually pretty much the universal type of European shield at that time. And most importantly, it is boss gripped, okay? So your hand goes into around a handle in the center, and it is covered by a boss. Now, this is a type of shield that goes all the way back into antiquity, all the way back to the Bronze Age. And we can find boss gripped shields right the way through the Roman era, early migration era, and this was the kind of universal way of gripping shield. Now, they weren't all flat, they weren't all round, they weren't all the same size. So commonly we find that the Viking shields surviving archaeologically seem to be bigger than the, should we say, Anglo-Saxon shields from the same period. So it does seem that size varied depending on where you were. Equally, a lot of artwork shows these as being convex and curved, so that's another variation. But the one thing that they all have in common is they are gripped in the centre. Now, as you'll see, towards the end of the Viking era, so we're talking about the 10th and 11th centuries, we move to having a strapped N-arms, as they're commonly called. So straps whereby your arm goes through one or two and holds the third one. Now, there is some debate. This is possibly a slightly later arrangement of straps, and there is some debate. So this strap which goes around your neck, the guige, there is some debate about the arrangement of the original straps, but we won't get into that detail in this video. Again, that's worthy of a video of itself. But you'll notice, and lots of people ask this on my channel, Matt, why does your kite shield have a boss on it? Well, quite simply because the early ones in art are shown with bosses on, and almost certainly this is tradition, and this is a vestigial remnant of boss gripped shields. And you know, people are sometimes slow to change with technology. Sometimes they just have in their head, well, you know, a shield's supposed to have a boss in the centre. There are some people argue that this has a practical purpose for somehow stopping weapons or spear shafts, swords, axes, whatever, sliding down the face, and it might have a benefit even to binding against another person's shield. Possibly. Some people even say it's for striking the opponent. I don't believe that so much, because you can do that with anything pretty much, especially the shield rim. I think this is probably just a leftover of technology. You'll notice it's become very small. So even if this had a grip in the centre, your hand wouldn't fit into this little boss. So I think it's a leftover. It's just a bit of tradition, I believe. But I accept that other people have other ideas, and I'm very interested in those ideas. But the important thing is this is strapped in some way. Now, the question is, why did they move from boss gripped to strapped? And this does connect to the fact that we've now got this long teardrop shape of shield. Well, I'll come back to that in a second, but first of all I want to say, well, where did this idea for having a strapped shield come from? Now, I believe that it may have been a Norman innovation and introduction to Europe due to their contact with areas outside Europe, because actually if we start to look outside Europe during this period, then indeed we do find shields which have straps of various kinds on the inside, and they are from predominantly Islamic areas, which the Normans were in contact with. So the Normans were in contact with North Africa and obviously Islamic Spain, various areas near to the Byzantine Empire, and some of these, possibly the Persians, and some of these areas did use shields that had, or sepa as they'd be called in Persia, that had styles of strap on the inside. And I think that might be, it's not categorical, but that might be where the Normans or whoever else, the Byzantines maybe, got the idea for these strapped shields. So I think there was a lot of different cultural exchange going on around the year 1000 AD, and this led to strapped shields. Now, the question that we come to next, therefore, is why did the Normans want to switch from what their ancestors had been using, a boss-gripped round shield, either convex or flat? Why did they want to switch from that to a teardrop shield with straps on it? And my answer is probably not at all revolutionary, and a lot of you will be shouting this at your monitors right now, your phones, wherever you're watching. And that, I think, is probably predominantly to do with cavalry. Okay, so the one big thing that the Normans did with their style of warfare was highly mobile cavalry forces supported by fortifications known as castles, Motte and Bailey type castles that they sprung up in areas they wanted to control, and they operated highly mobile forces, cavalry forces from there. Now, this wasn't an entirely new thing. Of course, there were other cultures doing that in other parts of Europe, further to the east, in fact in the Islamic kingdoms as well, to the south they were doing that, and the west. They were doing similar types of warfare, this kind of highly mobile cavalry forces with multiple weapons. And importantly, the Normans were a product partly of their Viking ancestry, which was perhaps not as big as some people have made it, but also of the various peoples that made up what's now France, so the Franks and so on and so forth. So the people of Normandy had this Frankish style of warfare from Carolingian times. Now, under Charlemagne in the 8th century, he had had knights, as they would later be known, like his hero Roland, who operated highly mobile cavalry forces, and they did actually operate in some ways very similarly to the later Normans. And they were inspired partly by Islamic forces that they had fought against, as well as other people to the east like the Avars as well. So they had highly mobile cavalry forces just like the Normans. Why didn't they develop special shields? Because they were using boss-gripped shields. I can't answer that question. I don't know. If you've got any ideas, I'd be happy to hear those. But what's interesting is a lot of the forces that did use, outside of Europe, that did use highly mobile cavalry forces, did have strapped shields. Now, in case it's not obvious, why do you want a strapped shield if you're predominantly a cavalry force? Well, quite simply, because it enables you to use the reins of the horse more easily. Okay, so it frees your hand up to hold the reins. It means that you can move the reins around and still have the shield close to your body and in front of you. It is more inconvenient, shall we say, to do that when you've got a boss grip shield. Not to say you can't do it. And in fact, not everyone held reins. So of course, we do know about some people using bows from horseback when they're either not holding the reins at all, or there's some tales about them holding them in the teeth. There's people that use glaives and naganatas and things like this in the Far East from horses without holding the reins. And indeed, there's earlier, if we go back to the Roman era, there's certain types of saddles which have prongs on them, so you don't have stirrups either, but you may not hold the reins in those situations either. So there are ways you can get around it, and there are ways you can operate as a cavalry force with boss gripped shields. But I think that the Normans probably wanted a shield which suited their very specific style of cavalry warfare, but also something very specific about their style of cavalry warfare. So for centuries, people had been using shields and spears on horseback in warfare. This was nothing new. However, what the Normans seem to have done is they seem to have combined the use of the longish spear, known now of course as a lance. I'm just using a winged spear here for because I don't have enough space between me and the camera to use a lance, and the shield, and they couched it. Now this is not something that they did universally, and I have to say I think that some historians have made a little bit too much of this. The fact is, when we look at period artwork and we see the Normans using on horseback using the spear and shield, we see it used in the conventional old overhand stabbing way. We also see it used in the underhand stabbing way as well. So, and this obviously depends partly on whether you're engaged, if you're actually doing a cavalry charge, or if you're engaged in a melee, or if you're attacking infantry on foot, for example, and you're trying to get over the top of their shields, over the top of their shield wall. So there's a lot of context wrapped up in this whole thing. But the fact is that we know that in this period, the couched lance on horseback together with the shield were two things that started to become more important, and also the use of stirrups as well, which had been around for a while, but which seem to have formulated into this more shock hit, heavy cavalry charge that we start to see in the Norman era start to come in. And I think that that almost certainly is where the importance of the kite shield comes in. Because by tucking yourself in behind it and this coming down the side of the horse, it forms a very complete protection, and you can have your lance right against the shield and your helmet, which leaves only a small opening behind here, which means that you're essentially presenting to the enemy a spike out the front and a fast-moving wooden wedge, essentially, because your shield is completely sloping off to this side, with this edge of the shield on this side and completely sloping off there. So in theory, their lance can come in and hit here and slide off. And if you can find an opening with your point, you'll impale them or their horse in the same moment. Now, of course, this tail protects your leg. It provides a full protection all the way down your abdomen and thigh when you're on the in the saddle on the horse. But it also, to some degree, protects the side of the horse as well. And importantly, if we're actually attacking over here, so if the lance is going over the neck of the horse and we're striking someone on that side, it means that the shield is presenting a full protection all the way down my body and protecting part of the horse as well. So it's a very, very good shaped shield for that purpose. So the kite shield is very, very well suited towards this type of heavy shock cavalry charge, where you're trying to hide yourself as much as possible behind the shield. Now, one of the questions we have to ask, of course, in the middle of this topic is, given that the Normans developed this kite shaped shield, why did most of the rest of the world, who were also using cavalry forces, also with lances, similar type of horses, similar period type of warfare, why did they not develop a similar type of shield in other places? For example, why did the Persians not use this style of shield? Well, I think there's a number of points we need to address about that, and it's a very complicated topic, and almost certainly I could do a big video just on that topic alone, but I'm just going to skip over it with a few light points. First of all, I think it was the Normans and this era in Europe that specialised in this heavy cavalry shock, using the couched lance, using the stirrups to deliver these very heavy shock charges. And it's in that context that this long shield probably makes the most sense. Additionally, unlike Charlemagne's earlier cavalry, and unlike, shall we say, most Persian cavalry, or indeed if we look at North African cavalry, the Norman knights, or knights of the Norman era, doesn't necessarily need to be from Normandy, were quite specialised in their weapons and equipment. Okay, they wore heavy mail, as much of it as they could get for the period that they were in. They wore good helmets with nasals, quite protective again for the period. They, in some cases, probably wore some type of chest protection as well. As early as the late 11th century, we have references to there being additional breast defences, probably underneath the mail, but certainly underneath the surcoat. And in addition to that, they only really used the lance and the sword. Yep, okay, occasionally they had maces, occasionally they had axes, but essentially their primary weapon was the lance, their secondary weapon was the sidearm, the sword or the axe. Now, in contrast to that, a lot of other places that made extensive use of cavalry, the cavalry often had other weapons. They didn't have such, perhaps they didn't have such sort of heavy lances, perhaps such long lances, but they used bows and they fought in numerous different ways. So they were multi-role. They weren't as specialised as the Norman era heavy cavalry were. So it's my belief and my understanding that this shield is very much, it's kind of think of it as a heavy shock cavalry shield. And whilst it can be used in foot and it can be used in other contexts, and you could say it's an early ancestor in the way of the pavis, and it's not that different if you use it on foot to something like a Roman scutum. It is a bit, but not hugely. So it can be used on foot, but I think for cavalry, most cavalry wanted a shield that they could sling on their back or their horse and use a bow. They could easily dismount and mount up quickly with it. They didn't necessarily have squires and attendants to help them with all of their stuff. So that it was probably, they wanted more versatile, lighter, smaller shields because they had a multiple role, whereas the Norman type European cavalry, heavy cavalry, was more specialised in its role. So that, I think that's why it ended up with a specialised shield. So gradually this developed into the knightly heater shield, as we'll call it. The simple change was that the top was essentially cut off. Now, initially there is a change in size, and I'll talk about that as well here. But we do see a slight shortening of the teardrop of the bottom, and we start to see the top. Initially it gets less and less curved, and gradually it becomes straight. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, you even get cutouts and stuff, and later on, really in the late 14th century, we start to see sometimes a cutout here for the lance to come through, which some people might think of as a specialised jousting sort of affectation, but in fact we do see these cutouts and other funky shapes certainly in artwork shown on the battlefield as well. So I actually think that the heater shield, sometimes with cutout shapes to the edges, sometimes with some degree of fluting, and more or less curved, was relatively universal, certainly through the 13th and 14th centuries. Now the two questions are, why did the top get cut off? And the second one is, why did the shield get smaller? Well, I am actually going to address the second question first here. So as for why did it get shorter and shorter, I suspect that this is strongly related to the armour that men-at-arms or knights were wearing at this time. So the general tendency was in the Norman era for them to actually not have mail on their legs. So if we look at the Bayeux Tapestry, for example, they've got mail down to their knees, and then they've got some type of leg bindings below that. So their legs were more or less vulnerable in the era of the kite shield. But already in the 12th century we start to see mail all the way down the legs, full mail, long sleeves and long chausses or trousers essentially. And then going into the 13th century, we actually start to see in the 13th century the first leg defences, plate leg defences, greaves come in, and pollines for the knees and so on and so forth. So actually some of the first plate armour we see with any regularity is actually on the legs. So I suspect that essentially as leg armour, and bear in mind mail is a pretty good defence just by itself if it's well-made mail. So mail chausses and then later plate additions to those mail chausses meant that you didn't need such a long shield. So I think that's relatively easy to address, and also in the 15th century the shields get smaller and smaller in general, and again that's related to armour development, I think. So as you've got more and more armour, this becomes less and less critical, and eventually of course it was abandoned by, not always, but it was abandoned by lots of knights or men-at-arms on the battlefield. Didn't carry shields at all. They never fully disappeared, they were still around, but they were just less common, less frequent. So armour, I think, is the answer to that. Why was the top cut off? Well, that is much more difficult to answer, and I'm not fully sure I have a good answer for you, but I've got maybe some ideas. Okay, so first of all, I think if you're on horseback and you're wearing a or carrying rather, a Norman kite shield. And your idea is to tuck yourself in behind the shield like this, okay? What does happen is by having that arch, that rounded top, you actually block out your vision quite a lot over here, but you still want, where you want the shield's protection, kind of in front of your face here, is lacking, and then this bit over here blocks out your peripheral vision off to the side. So it kind of, I think, is a vision thing. When we cut the top of the shield off to create the heater shield here, you'll notice that now when I tuck myself in behind it, okay, I can actually look all the way around over the top of my shield and still have this part of my shield in front of my face. What's going on at the back doesn't actually make very much difference, although I will point out to you that you'll notice that point actually protects right the way around my shoulder blade. So if I'm tucked in here, not only can I see over the top and all the way around there, but it covers essentially both my shoulders if I'm getting completely tucked behind the shield. So I actually think that this particular format ends up, you wouldn't necessarily think it, but it ends up when it's in this position, giving quite a good amount of protection both in the front and in the rear, and allowing vision all around, which the arched top, I think, it gets in the way of vision, and then it doesn't have protection in the two places where you need it. So what I'm arguing, I suppose, is in a way, don't necessarily think about the top of the kite shield being cut off, but rather think about these corners being built up. And if you build up these corners to match the top, I think that's actually closer to what we see with the development of the heater shield. So there we have it. As always, I'm very interested to hear your comments, your thoughts, your contributions. Obviously, a lot of what I've expressed in this video is based on historical knowledge, historical fact, and some of it is just educated guesswork. The fact is, some of these things we just don't know, we can only have theories, but obviously some theories are better evidence than others. Absolutely categorically, the knightly kite shield is very distinctive to Europe during the medieval period. The sort of what everybody thinks of as the medieval knight shield, this is the shape of it. And I think categorically it came from the Norman kite shield. We've looked at why possibly the Norman kite shield developed when it did and why it did for specialised heavy cavalry use, and probably with inspiration certainly for the way it was held from outside Europe. I think there was a strong Islamic connection to how the straps were held at the back and the idea for doing that. And indeed, why did this hang around for so long? Well, it obviously worked very well, didn't it? So it worked as a shield. But also, I think there's a degree of cultural kind of recognition, even in the period, that this was a knight shield. If you were a knight, you had a straight cross-hilted sword most of the time, and you carried a lance, and you rode a horse, and you had a shield that was that shape. And it's funny because when we see specialised shields in the 15th century for jousting or just for warfare in general, they almost struggle to try and keep the knightly shape. And I think this was partly due to a preconception of, well, a knight should look like X, and so that's what a knightly shield should look like. So even though they built in flutes to it, and even though they had a cutout for the lance and things like this, and sometimes other weird and funky shapes, I think the strong idea of the knightly shield was still present even then. And you do still see these in 16th century art, and as we know, if we come forward in time to the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, and we look at heraldry and heraldic ideas, remember these shields, and this is very important as well, carried heraldry on the front, and in some cases the exact arrangement of that heraldry was designed to fit on a knightly shield. So that was another thing keeping the knightly shield in service, as it were, because it's like, well, my heraldry's been this shape for 300 years. I don't want to change it now. So when you have your heraldry painted on your grand hall's wall, or you have it on your signet ring, or you have it painted on the side of your carriage, it's still in a shield shape. And even today, when people win sporting trophies, very often they're on a shield-shaped plaque. When you shoot a gazelle, when people in the 19th century or 20th century shot gazelles in Africa and mounted on the wall, they're often on a wooden plaque that's in the shape of a shield. So the shape of the knightly shield is extremely embedded in all of our culture. And sometimes, for that reason, we don't think about the why and the when and the how, because it's just, well, that's just the way it is. And it was the same for them as well. So anyway, I think it's a very interesting topic, probably one I'll revisit as well. And I think there are some of the things I've covered in this video which I can unpack into separate little points and go a bit more in depth into some of those. But as I say, as always, very interested to hear your inputs and comments below. If you're not subscribed, why? Please do so now. Give us a like, and I will see you back on this channel really soon for another video on historical weapons and warfare and other things of interest to you guys. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.